We're going to take a look at one of my favorite lenses ever. It's the Sony 100mm F2.8 GM OSS Macro Lens, and this is a killer lens. The 100mm F2.8 macro is the best macro that Sony has ever made. In fact, I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm not being hyperbolic here. I think that this is the best macro lens ever. This lens does stuff that I genuinely did not think was possible in a macro lens. We're talking 2.8 times life-size magnification with teleconverters. Without the teleconverter, it is 1.4 times life-size, and I will show you why that's important in a minute. So with this lens, you can do handheld shooting at distances that used to really need tripods. And this lens has autofocus that actually tracks things like flying insects. This is an incremental improvement. For me, it's like a completely different world of macro photography. Okay, let's start with what macro even means, because a lot of marketing departments love calling anything that focuses close a macro lens, and that is just not true. A true macro lens gives you a 1-to-1 reproduction. A 7mm B takes up 7mm on your sensor. This is your camera's imaging sensor, and when you want to take a picture of a bee, normally you would see this bee, and the bee would be about that big on the sensor. So teeny bee, if you want to crop in on the bee, you're losing all the rest of the sensor. So what camera companies call macro lenses are often close-up lenses. And with a close-up lens, this here is your bee. Now obviously the size of the bee isn't changing. We don't have a picture of a gigantic bee, but I want to show you on a close-up lens, what you end up getting is something like this. The bee takes up a lot more of the space of the sensor, which means that if you crop into this bee, you're going to have a lot more detail, a lot more resolution. This is for a macro lens. So with a macro lens, it is lifetime 1-to-1, which means that if a bee takes up, say, 7mm in real life, it takes up 7mm on your sensor. And I don't have a bee that's bigger than this, but if you can imagine this getting about 50% larger, that's a 1.4 times life sensor. And then if you can imagine this getting 3 times larger, that is what you get with the 2.8 magnification with the teleconverter. And again, the bee doesn't change size, the lens determines how much of your sensor is taken up with B. Okay, thanks, honey. So let me show you why this is important. This here is a photograph I took of a bee using a lens that calls itself a macro lens, but actually is just a close-up lens. And I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but the bee is perfectly sharp in the original file, but cropping it makes it a little bit soft. And now here is a bee that was photographed with Sony's lens at the 1.4 times life. This wasn't even the 2.8 times life. This lens really delivers. I think you can see here the individual little hairs on this bee, and check out the compound eyes, and look at this adorable little antenna. I love bees. Class dismissed. Okay, so let's talk about image stabilization, because one of the key selling points of this lens is its built-in optical image stabilization. You can think of a macro lens like a telephoto lens, just for very, very small things. And so if you've ever worked with a telephoto lens, you know that when you're on the wider end of the telephoto lens, a little bit of hand motion is easily taken up with the image stabilization. If you had no image stabilization, you could just shoot at a faster shutter rate in order to compensate for that little bit of motion that you might have. But when you're shooting a macro, it's like you're using a hyper telephoto lens, and so any hand motion is going to be exaggerated. And that's why the optical image stabilization in this lens is so important, because it gives you the ability to handhold things that you otherwise would have had to use a tripod for, and it also gives you the ability to use a slower shutter speed in order to get more light in when you're taking your picture. Because this lens has optical image stabilization and it works with the in-body image stabilization on the cameras, you get more than the 4 or 5 stops of stabilization that the camera would give you. But the TLDR here is that this lens and the bodies that you put them on have a really good stabilization system that allows you to shoot much slower, or allows you to shoot much closer to your subject without getting a lot of motion blur. Because at these sizes, your depth of field is measured in fractions of a millimeter. At 2.8 magnification, you've got about 1/3 of a millimeter in focus. 1/3 of a millimeter. Breathe wrong and you've missed the shot. But the image stabilization really handles it well, and the cool thing is that you can focus on something with 1/3 of a millimeter of focal distance, and the camera won't shake as you're trying to compose that shot. That's just great. This lens has every control a macro shooter actually needs. The focusing ring shows distance markers in feet, meters, and magnification ratios. There are 2 programmable buttons on the barrel that default to focus hold, and I use these constantly. The aperture ring is clickable or declickable, your choice, which makes it really good for video. Moving up the barrel, there's the optical stabilization switch, which I only turn off if I'm doing something on a tripod. And the dynamic manual focus I was talking about, this lens put that right on the barrel. Also, while I'm at it, if you like these kind of real-world honest reviews, go ahead and boop the buttons below. We really love when you like and subscribe. Keeps us going. There are 3 ways on this lens to switch to manual focus, but there's only one problem. That focus mode color is way too easy to bump accidentally. When I'm shooting a lens with a lens hood, I'll often just flip it around backwards when I'm not using it, which is what I do when I'm using a macro lens, or especially macro lens with a teleconverter, so that the lens doesn't hit my subject or hit something near my subject. So the problem is when you turn the lens hood around on the front of the lens, it makes the collar even easier to knock because the lens hood's covering it and you're not quite sure where that is. So that absolutely needs some way to lock it. And that's it. That's pretty much my only complaint about this lens. Let's talk a little bit about why the image quality is so good on this lens and why it is so sharp. Generally speaking, the more elements and groups that you have in a lens, the better the image quality, because each of those elements and groups help fix something that is typically a problem with the lens. This lens has got 2 XA, which is extreme aspherical elements, 2 ED elements, nano AR coating 2 to kill flare, and fluorine coating up front. If you don't know what any of those means, don't really worry about it. It just means that it's designed to be super sharp. It also has an 11 blade aperture, which is unusually good for a macro lens. Most high-end portrait lenses use something like 9 aperture blades to get a nice soft defocus. I've seen them starting to creep up to like 10 aperture blades. But in the macro world, where the background defocus is sometimes half or more of the image that you're making, it makes a real difference to have more aperture blades. The transitions from sharp to soft are gradual and beautiful. And all that glass inside of the lens needs some really fast and powerful motors, and that is what the 4XD linear motors in this lens do. So for comparison, that's double what the original GM lenses had for motors. So this is fast, this is quiet, and moving all of that glass back and forth happens completely quietly, which is great for video. Although that said, if you're doing video of these ants, you probably don't need to be quiet because I don't think ants can hear you anyhow. I'm not sure about that. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. Can ants hear? Let's talk about autofocus some more. At 1.4 times life, the magnification is really, really impressive. Shooting fast-moving bees felt like shooting birds with the telephoto lens. You just lock onto it and let it track. That is not normal for a macro lens, and it's still not normal for some telephoto lenses on some systems. Sony's insect detection system works well, although at extreme close-up distances, it does get confused. I don't know if a camera can really tell the difference between a bee's eye and a bee's abdomen when that's all that fills the frame. Sometimes it locks onto the eye, sometimes the fuzzy body. That's just the reality of working with things like insects at these distances. Same thing here with the pictures of my cat. The animal eye detect autofocus is really fantastic in Sony cameras, and as I got really close to the cat, it would still focus well. But once I got into a more macro distance to the camera, it focused on the fur around his eye instead of the actual eye, and again, at this distance there's really no face to recognize, so the camera just doesn't really know if you're looking at an eyeball or just something round. I didn't shoot as many portraits as I wanted because I was so busy testing the macro stuff with this lens, but this lens absolutely works as a portrait lens, which means that you get 2 different kinds of lenses in one lens for a lighter, smaller camera bag. With that 100mm focal length, you get really nice separation with your subjects, and wide open, the defocus is really, really pretty. That 11 blade aperture really keeps the bokeh smooth and natural looking. And even with the 2x teleconverter on, the images were still sharp, they were still usable. That is really rare in a lens at this focal length. This lens feels like it was designed by people who actually shoot macro. A lot of the close-up lenses I use are macro lenses. It feels like the magnification was sort of like an afterthought, or they're trying to make a lens that was a macro lens, but not really put enough effort into making that lens. This lens is a macro lens. The controls, the stabilization, the native teleconverter support, it is all stuff that real macro shooters need. Is this a perfect lens? Well, to me, it's almost a perfect lens. That focus collar is too sensitive, and the autofocus will, of course, slow down at extreme magnifications, but those are really minor trade-offs for what you get with this lens. For anybody serious about macro photography, product work, detail shooting, this is easily the best option for Sony E-mount. And if you shoot portraits, it handles that without compromise too. I'm already saving up to add this lens to my personal kit, which I think should tell you everything you need to know about what I think about this lens. Questions? Drop them in the comments below. If you're a macro shooter, what kind of things do you normally shoot and what lens are you using? Whether it's Sony or any other platform, I would love to know. For Imaging Resource, I am editor David Schloss, and until next time, go out there and give it your best shot.